Well, good morning, White Flag. How's everybody doing this morning? Good. Well, we are glad that you guys are joining us this morning. And if you're online watching, it was a pleasure chatting with some of you before I came out here. Again, we are glad you're joining us as well. Well, my name is Jason. I'm the discipleship pastor, and I get the honor of bringing the message today. But we do want to let you know that we are only 4 weeks away from Pastor Paul being back and returning and sharing the message with us. So there you go. That is a good thing to applaud. But we want you guys to keep praying for Paul and Julia as they wrap up this sabbatical. I want you to pray that God is continuing to refresh them, recharge their batteries, get them back here and ready to lead us into the next season of ministry. But I don't think you have to wait a month just to come back and see something like that. Next week, there is something you really, really want to be here in the room for. Next week, for the first time at White Flag, our worship pastor, Titus, is actually going to be bringing the message. And if you've seen the energy he brings on stage, you want to be here in the room because you never know what might happen during the message, right? All kidding aside, we are really excited for what's going to happen next week when Titus is here. But, man, I just want to start off this morning by asking you a question. When you were a kid, or maybe did your kids ever do this thing where they cross their fingers and they put it behind their back as some kind of get out of a life free card, right? You know what I'm talking about? Like, hey, did you clean your room? Oh, absolutely. Just kidding, my fingers were crossed. Or maybe they did this thing where you're like, hey, did you brush your teeth? And they're like, oh, absolutely. Come here. No, your breath is terrible. Get upstairs and try that again, right? Or maybe did you hit your brother? No. Really, you were the only one home with him. How did that happen? I don't know who did it. It's just a mystery. My fingers were crossed. It really doesn't matter, right? I mean, and my guess is a lot of kids do this, and I don't know if they pick it up at preschool or where they get it, but when I was growing up, my brother and sister and I were so notorious for this. It got to the point, I think my parents finally said, all right, did you do this? And I go, no, before you answer, put your hands out in front of you and spread your fingers so we can see to make my parents are sitting right here laughing at this thing. But yeah, spread your fingers and so we can see that. But then it got to the point with my brother, it was, all right, not only do that, take your socks and shoes off because he was crossing his toes inside of his shoes to get out of things like that, right? And it's not just that as little kids we try to twist the truth and find a way to get out of things and try to feel like we've pulled one over on somebody. It changes as we get older how we do this. When I was a teenager, there was a time I went out with some friends and I told my mom, I said, hey, Mom, we're going to stay at John's place tonight. And she said, oh, that's fine. And so we go out and we're out all night. We're doing, hanging out. And the next morning I get home and my mom says, where were you last night? I was at John's place. And she said, no, you weren't. I tried to call his mom because I needed to talk to you about something this morning. And she said, you guys hadn't been there all night. And I said, well, see, what happened was John's parents moved out of an apartment into the house that they're living in now, but he still had the keys to the apartment. So technically, we did stay at John's place. It just wasn't where his parents were, right? Because I knew that if I told her that that his parents weren't going to be there, there was no way she was going to let me stay there for the night. And so you see how you I didn't lie. I was telling the truth. It just wasn't the whole truth, right? And it doesn't change as we get older. As adults, we twist the truth and we try to manipulate the truth to benefit ourselves. I mean, we've created a whole profession of people who lie, who manipulate, they speak in half-truths and don't really say anything. We call them politicians, right? And I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, they never say anything. They get asked a question and they dance around the question, they manipulate the truth, and they'll say a bunch of things that may sound real, but nothing you can actually hold them accountable for, because the last time a politician said something that was definite, he said, read my lips, no new taxes, and then raised taxes, and then never got reelected again, right? So that's what happens when you do that kind of stuff. But believe it or not, Jesus actually has something to say about the way that we use truth and what our word actually means in our life. And if you've been with us the last couple weeks, we've been in a series called Red Letter Life, and we've talked about how there are words in the Bible that just stand out more than others. There are words in the Bible that are in red letters, and these are the words of Jesus himself. And Jesus is kind of teaching us through some of these red letter words what life should look like as his follower. And we've been following along in the Sermon on the Mount talking about the different things that Jesus is saying about the world says this is normal, but I'm going to teach you how something else is normal, what it should look like if you're my follower. And so today we're going to start in the passage where Jesus is talking about the importance of sticking to our word, of being honest in the things we say. And we're going to start in Matthew chapter 5, verse 33. And Jesus says this, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Again, if you were here last week, you remember Steve talking about this. He said, Jesus goes into this pattern where he says, you have heard it said, or this is what the law says, but I tell you, this is what life should look like as my follower. You have heard it said, this is what the world thinks is normal, but I'm going to show you a different way. Now, when you study this passage, one of the things I've heard people talk about is some people will interpret this as another way of saying, oh, you shouldn't swear. You shouldn't use God's name in vain. And while Jesus doesn't want you to do that, that's not really what Jesus is talking about here. This isn't really the point. Jesus is actually talking about how people manipulate the truth, how we twist the truth to fit our own needs and our own wants and our own desires. You see, something was actually happening in Jesus' culture that was where the Pharisees were actually taking some of these things about oaths and they were twisting them and making the commands of God fit their needs and their wants. And they were taking the truth of God, the truth of the law, and they were twisting it for their own advantage. But this isn't much different than today, quite honestly. Quite honestly, we have churches and people today who look at God's word and they try to use God's word and bend it to what they want it to mean. They bend it to fit their own agenda instead of reading the heart of what God is actually trying to say, what Jesus is actually trying to teach us. And so Jesus is actually, in the middle of this passage, pointing back to a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 23. It starts in verse 21. It says this, "If you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to pay for it. For the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from making a vow, you will not be guilty." And so God is telling the people, listen, if you make a vow in my name, what you're doing is you're inviting me into this covenant between you and this other person. So now you're promising before me that whatever you said to that person, whatever you swore to that person, you're going to fulfill it. And now you've involved me in all of that. And if you don't intend to fulfill it, just don't say it. Don't swear to me. Don't swear an oath and think that somehow you don't have to actually fulfill it. It's better if you just don't swear at all. And so the Pharisees and the scribes of Jesus' days started saying, okay, how do we work around this whole thing? So we don't swear an oath to God and get ourselves in trouble. How do we kind of make this so we can still use oaths and get out of whatever we're trying to say here? And so they started this whole weird system of how and what they could swear on in order to get out of the promises they were making. They actually had this whole written law about what they could say, and the closer they got to actually swearing to God, the more severe the oath became, more binding the oath became. So they started saying things like, well, I swear on the temple. I swear on the altar. I swear on myself. I swear on the clothes that I'm wearing. They started swearing on all these different things, but what would happen is it got very confusing for the average person. Now, understand that in this Jewish culture, they were a word of mouth, an oath-based society, which meant whatever you said, that was a binding kind of contract between them. Now, we don't live in this kind of world today. If you walked into a bank today and said, hey, Mr. Banker, I want to borrow $150,000 for this house, and he stuck out his hand, shook your hand, and you just walked away, and that was the end of it. You just got to borrow the money. That would never happen, right? If you've ever bought a house, you know that you've got to fill out a stack of paperwork like this just to walk out the door with the key to the front door. But they lived in a society where oaths meant everything. And the average person, not the educated scribe or Pharisee, the average person, all they knew was that oaths were supposed to be binding. And so what would happen is the scribes, the Pharisees, they started promising things like, well, I will pay you for that land, I swear on my head. And what would happen is when it came time to pay, the scribe or Pharisee would say, yeah, it wasn't really a binding oath, so I don't really have to pay you back. There's no penalty for me. There's no honor in it for me to actually have to pay you back. And so people started to get cheated out of things, and the Pharisees and the scribes were using this whole system, this law that God had given, for their own benefit, to gain their own power, to gain their own prestige, and to build up their own kind of wallet or their own wealth. And believe it or not, this bothered Jesus so much. This isn't the only time in Matthew's gospel that Jesus addresses this very issue. He comes back to this in Matthew chapter 23, starting in verse 16. He says, "Woe to you, blind guides." Now pay attention. Anytime Jesus says, "Woe to you," you ought to really pay attention because he's about to really give it to somebody. He's about to really go off on somebody. "Woe to you, blind guides, you say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it." So essentially, Jesus is saying, listen, you can swear on the shirt on your back, or you can swear on a cross, and it makes no difference whatsoever, because here's the thing. The shirt, God gave the materials to make the shirt. He gave you a job, people to buy the shirt. It belongs to God. It all belongs to God. And when we try to kind of divide this out and try to make excuses, God's saying, listen, it's all mine. So if you swear on anything, you're promising to God that you're going to fulfill this promise. So Jesus is saying, listen, Pharisees, scribes, you're missing the point. You are missing the heart of all of this. It isn't about the words you say. It's not about the things you swear on. You don't get to draw up all these weird rules and these regulations and think that somehow that's getting you out of things. Because it's about the heart of the issue. It's about where's your heart at? Where's your intent at in what you're promising? Sometimes people hear this passage from Jesus when he says, don't swear an oath. And what happens is there are groups of Christians out there that will say, well, you know what that really means? That means we're not allowed to swear an oath to anybody, any place. And so there are groups of people out there that think that means when you go to court and they ask you to put your hand on the Bible and say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, that kind of oath, that you shouldn't do that. Or maybe if you belong to some kind of civic organization, like I grew up in Boy Scouts, my kids were in Scouts, and every meeting we had to say the Scout oath and the Scout law and make these promises. And so some people would interpret this to say, no, you shouldn't do that at all. That's against what Jesus is teaching. But that's not really where Jesus is going with this. Jesus is saying, listen, if you're going to swear an oath, you better mean it. In fact, in the Old Testament, you see times where God swears an oath. You see a point where Jesus swears an oath when he's on trial. Paul swears an oath later in the New Testament. And I think if God didn't want us swearing an oath to something, there wouldn't be these other good examples of what it looks like to make promises and to swear an oath. And I think Jesus is trying to say, listen, here's the problem. As my followers, you can't make all these ridiculous rules up about what's okay and what's not okay. Because no matter what you swear on, it's all mine. So you can make up all the goofy workarounds you want, but you are swearing to God. But before we're so quick to judge the Pharisees and the scribes and think that they're the only ones that manipulate the truth to their benefit and their own need and their own wants and desires, Let's take a quick moment and just look at some of the things that maybe we do in our own lives. Here's the first one: taxes. When it comes time to do taxes, if you can make an error or a omission that nobody can catch that will get you a better refund or to make you pay less, I would bet that most of us in the room will take every opportunity we can to do that. Now, I'm not faulting you. I'm just saying we're manipulating the truth in the heart of the law in order for our own gain, for our own benefit. Here's a little more practical example. What about when somebody says, hey, can you help me out? And if you're like me, you have a hard time saying no to things. You have a hard time saying no to people. And so your first instinct is to immediately say, yeah, sure, I can do that. Well, everything in your head is saying, no, no, no. But what comes out of your mouth is yes. And then later, when it's time to fulfill that promise, what happens is you either can't do it, you can't follow through on what you said, or you can't do your best to the best of your ability doing it because you've so overstretched yourself that you can't follow through on those promises. Well, here's the thing. Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Sometimes it's okay to say, no, I can't do that. No, I'm stretched too thin. I don't have the ability to do that. Sometimes we want to spare people's feelings and we don't want to offend them. We don't want them upset if we say no. But truthfully, Jesus is saying, listen, it's better to say no and mean no than to say yes and never follow through on any of that. You know, here's another thing. What about when it comes to your prayer life? What happens when you tell people, listen, I'll pray for you? Do you follow through on those prayers? What about with your kids? Here's one my kids are notorious for, right? So my kids, sometimes I'll say, you know, hey, what's going on with this? Why, you know, how did this get broken? And the first thing they want to do is say, well, he did it, right? I mean, that's always the response every kid gets. It's their brother or sister's fault. But they'll both tell me the truth, right? Or at least their version of the truth. Whatever truth makes them look best, looks less guilty, or, you know, my kids are only a year apart. I think sometimes they tell whatever truth will make their sibling look worse. I think that's sometimes their goal in all of this. And so they'll manipulate the truth to their own benefit or to make sure the other person catches the blame. And it doesn't just happen with kids. It happens with spouses. It happens in other relationships. I mean, I've sat across a desk or a table from somebody talking to them about something that happened in a relationship. And you can hear two people talk about the exact same event. And they'll talk about it and tell two different versions of the exact same story. But without fail, they'll tell the version of the story that makes themselves look the best. And so they'll manipulate the truth and they'll twist the truth in order to do that. Here's a good one. What about our media? What about our media and how they twist truth? I mean, truthfully, let's be honest. I don't care if you're conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat. Can we just be honest that every news organization has their own agenda and they're pushing their own agenda? I don't care if you're watching CNN or you're watching Fox. It makes me no difference, but the truth is, Fox is going to tell you the truth from their perspective, whatever fits their narrative, and CNN is going to do the same thing. And for years, I've told my kids, I said, listen, if you go out there and you watch a video from CNN or you read a news story from Newsweek, whatever it may be, then you better go out and find the same news event from a conservative site and read that. Because the truth is, neither one of those people are telling you the truth. The truth lies somewhere in between the two of them. And so the media does what we all want to do. We have an agenda we want to push. We have a narrative we want people to hear. And so we twist the truth to make it fit. And at the heart of all of these things, at the heart of all of these untruths or these partial truths is a desire or this need to be deceitful. It's the same intent the Pharisees had in his day. Take the heart of the truth, twist it to our advantage. And here's where Jesus continues to teach his disciples. He continues to say, listen, if you are my follower, if you're going to follow me, you have to look different. You can't go around twisting the truth. People need to trust what you say. Look what he says again in Matthew 5:37. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this, it comes from the evil one. And Jesus says, listen, if you're going to be my follower, if you're going to pursue me and be my disciple, people have to be able to assume that what you say to them is something you actually mean, that you're going to follow through on the promises that you made, that you're a person of your word, that you're being honest with them. Because truth is who God is. And if you're going to be his follower, then you should be a person of truth as well. In other words, there is no need in the middle of a conversation to say something like, I swear this is what happened, or cross my heart, hope to die, this is what happened. Because if you're like me, and I'm in the middle of a conversation with somebody, and suddenly they look at me and I say, I swear this is what happened. My first thought is, so everything you told me before that was a lie? You didn't mean any of this? But people do it all the time. We'll say, I swear, I swear, I swear. And if you're a follower of Jesus, there shouldn't be a need for you to have to say that. So, in other words, don't be like the politicians. Don't be like the Pharisees, where you try to dance around the truth, that you try to manipulate the truth. Never say maybe to an answer. Either say yes or no. Don't practice being deceitful. Don't practice being deceitful or twisting the truth in your life. Get rid of this deceitful speech that you've been saying to people. Let your yes be yes or your no be no. When you tell somebody that you're going to help them, that you're going to show up at 5 o'clock and you're going to be there to help them, show up. If you said yes, follow through. Be there. Do what you promised. Here's a big one, because I asked several people this week the same question. When somebody says, will you pray for me? Almost every person I talked to said either they have or had previously had an issue where somebody asked them to pray, they've gotten home and totally forgot to pray for that person. They may have intended to, but they never really followed through. So let me give you a quick solution to that. If somebody comes up to you and says, will you pray for me? Stop right then and there and pray for that person. Don't tell them you're going to do it and then never follow through and never actually pray for them. Make it a point that if you say this, that you're actually going to do it. Listen, when you make a commitment to somebody, follow through. Parents, here's a big one. If you tell your kids you're going to be at their game, or you tell your kids that you're going to be at whatever event you promised them, do everything in your power to actually show up. Nothing disheartens kids more, and most of the time in my eyes, is when parents tell them they're going to do something and they don't actually do it. Be a person that stays true to your word, that follows through, that tells kids, listen, we're going to do this, or I'm going to be there, and then you're actually there. Here's another one. When you tell somebody a story, when you're trying to explain something, don't exaggerate. You don't have to exaggerate the story. When you're late to work tomorrow morning, don't get to work and tell your boss, man, I'm late because the traffic was horrible, the stoplights, I hit every stoplight. Just be honest and say, I'm late because I was playing a game on my phone and I lost track of time, right? Just be honest with people. And I know that's a silly example, but we do it all the time. We exaggerate stories to embellish them, to make ourselves look better, instead of just telling the truth. And while all of these examples seem very simple, and maybe there are things you think, does Jesus even really care about these little things? Do they even really matter? Here's why they matter. When you practice being deceitful or telling half-truths and lies in those little areas of your life, it's an easy step to start being deceitful and untrue in the bigger areas of your life. When you start to twist the truth, when you think it doesn't matter, when it comes time that it really does matter, you'll be so practiced in doing this, you won't even think twice about doing exactly what the Pharisees did and twisting the truth. Because at the heart of all of what Jesus is saying in this entire passage is this. If you are my follower, it's all about integrity. It's all about being a person who lives with integrity, who does what you say you're going to do, who follows through on the promises that you've made. And my guess is, when we talk about integrity, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but it's not a word that often gets explained. So in a practical sense, this is what integrity looks like. If you borrow something from a friend or a neighbor and you promise that you're going to give it back to them, don't let it be in the back of your garage 3 years later that you've totally forgot to give it back to them. When you borrow money from a person or a bank, you pay back the money that you borrow from that person or that bank to the best of your abilities. And sometimes what that means is your primary job isn't enough to pay back those bills, and that means you have to go out and get a second job in order to pay those bills. But you do everything in your power to do what you claimed that you were going to do, to follow through on the word that you gave somebody. Integrity also means doing what you say. Sometimes integrity means doing what you say or doing the right thing, even when doing the wrong thing may gain financially for you, may actually have a benefit, and it's difficult to do. When I was probably 12 or 13 years old, when I joined Boy Scouts for the first time, my parents were taking me down to the scout shop to buy a scout uniform. Now, if you were never in Scouts, which you may not know, is the Boy Scout uniform may be the single most expensive set of clothes that you will ever buy in your life. Without joke, you're talking $200 to $300 sometimes for a scout uniform, which always floored me because you're putting this on kids who are going to destroy the uniform that you paid for, right? But it's expensive. And so my parents were taking me to the scout shop, and I remember the conversation on the way down. They're talking about how much this was going to cost, and financially it was going to be tough to buy all the stuff. And so we go in the store, and we buy the shorts and the pants and the socks and the belt and the shirt and on and on and on and all the other stuff. And we get in the car, and I remember my mom looking at the receipt going, man, that seems really cheap. It seems like maybe they missed something. And so she started to look through the receipt, only to realize that they didn't charge us for a $50 pair of pants. And so as a kid, of course, my thought was, woohoo, free pants, right? But my parents, of course, said, no, come on. You know that would not be the right thing to do. Especially since you're going to the Boy Scouts, that really wouldn't be the right thing to do. But so we walked back into the store and paid for the pants. And sometimes it's the right thing to do, even though we could have walked away and gained $50. It's the same thing applies to you if maybe you go through a drive-thru and the cashier gives you an extra $5 or $10 back because they miscounted the change. Integrity says you give it back. You don't put it in your pocket and drive away and go, oh, their mistake, not my problem, right? But there's times that, man, you have to try. Even if you end up not being able to give the thing back. My wife and I, when we were pretty newly married, we had ordered a quesadilla maker from Penny's. It was like still when you had to order from catalogs. And so we ordered this quesadilla maker, which was just like a $20 thing, right? So we get this box in the mail, and the box is like massive. And I'm like, what kind of quesadilla maker is this? I mean, are the burritos like that big around or something? And the box on the outside said quesadilla maker with a sticker on it. And so we go to open the box up, and on the inside was this stock pot. I mean, it was a huge stock pot. It's from the company, La Crucia, I don't remember. But it's expensive. I mean, it was like a $500 pot, right? And so we put the thing in the car, we take it to Penny's, and the lady at Penny's goes, I don't know what you want me to do with that. And I said, well, we ordered a quesadilla maker, and they sent this in the box. She goes, well, it says you got a quesadilla maker. And I'm like, I understand what it says. This is what they sent us. And she said, I don't know what to do with that. You just go ahead and take it. And I'm like, fine. So we left, and we came back a couple days later and tried again. And after the third time, the manager finally said, I can't send that back. I don't know what to do with it. Just take it home. Now, don't get me wrong, my wife uses that pot all the time now, but we did try multiple times to take it back because that was the right thing to do. Even though, trust me, that was a big gain in our favor, and that was a pot we would never buy on our own. We would never spend that kind of money on something like that. But yet, sometimes doing the right thing even means that we have to give up where we could gain, or give up where maybe we had a financial gain in all of this. Integrity means that in relationships, there's going to be times that maybe you know that you could get away with something and your spouse or your friend would never know what you did or what you said. And integrity says, I'm not crossing that line because it's not the right thing to do. Integrity in the workplace means that if you're hired to do a job, you do the job. You don't spend half your day trying to find a way to get out of the job, or half a day spreading gossip instead of actually doing your job. It means you do the job. It means you don't steal office supplies because you're out of paper at home and you're like, oh, look, a ream of paper, and you take it with you. Integrity means you may work in a place where there are all sorts of tools, and nobody else gets in trouble for taking tools home and using all the tools from work and never bringing them back, and it's never been an issue. But as a follower of Jesus, what that means is you don't take the tools. Even if no one else gets blamed or no one else gets in trouble for it, you don't do it because it's not the right thing to do. It's not the thing a person with integrity does. Because when you do that, it's a lie. You're lying to the people. And I saw this quote this week I thought was just great. It says, always remember, a partial truth is a whole lie. Just because you're twisting the truth or you're manipulating the truth doesn't mean that you're not lying to people. And I think, like I said, at the heart of everything Jesus has been talking about is this idea of integrity. And probably one of the greatest examples of integrity in all of Scripture is Daniel. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of Daniel, there's a couple things I think we can learn from his story this morning real quickly. Daniel was a young man that was taken captive, and that early on in the story, many of you probably know the story, when he's with his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the king challenges them to eat the food that he wants them to eat. And Daniel quickly says, no, I'm not going to do that. I won't do it because I follow God, and God says that this is the way we're supposed to eat, or this is what I'm supposed to eat. And so he sticks to it, even though the easy thing to do would have been to say, sure, no problem. I mean, I don't want to get in trouble, and it's just food, so I'm just going to eat that and go on. But Daniel is this young captive, and he says, no, I'm not going to do that. And Daniel starts, even at that young age, showing this integrity. And the story we're going to look at today is actually the story right before Daniel goes into the lion's den. At this point, Daniel is much older. He's probably in his 70s or 80s by the point of this story. And so Daniel now has lived this life of integrity continuously for all of these years. And here's the first thing I think we can learn from Daniel's story. Integrity starts in your private life. Integrity starts in your private life. Now, if you're familiar with the term structural integrity, if you've ever heard that in a construction sense, what that basically means is that the foundation and the framing of what you're doing is sound. And you could put things on it and it can withhold the pressure and the forces from the outside world. Kind of like if you read in the news a couple weeks ago or saw the video of the retaining wall that partially collapsed in Arnold, right? And you saw all of these blocks that had come down. Here's the issue. That wall had been having integrity issues for years. It didn't just all of a sudden fall. If you've read it in the news since then, they've been trying to patch cracks in that for 4 or 5 years now. And so there was integrity issues from all along, and sooner or later, the pressures of the world caused it to collapse. In much the same way, Daniel or us, we have to build this foundation and make it strong in order for us to be able to stand up to the way the world pushes and puts pressure on us. I want you to look at what it says in Daniel chapter 6, verse 3. It says, now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. I want you to think for a moment, what would it take for a king who had taken these people captive to say to one of the captives, I'm going to set you over the entire kingdom. I'm going to put you in charge of everything. You have to be a pretty special person for that to happen. And Daniel was a man of such integrity that the king was like, this is a guy that will do what he says he's going to do. That he'll do what is asked of him. He'll follow through on the promises that he makes. But Daniel had for years been building this private life, this relationship with God, praying and going to God in personal times. And the key for you and I is that we have to do the same thing. We have to pursue God in our private moments, in our alone time with God. And Steve talked about this last week. And we've actually talked about this for months now. We've talked about how we have to be building this personal relationship with God. That we have to be building this foundation with God. Because in the end, I know, like I said, we've been talking about this for several weeks. And I know some of you may be thinking, man, could you guys come up with a different point? Could you say something different one week? But here's why we keep coming back to this over and over again. Because everything else that we teach, everything else we talk about hinges on this relationship with God. You can try to do all the other things we talk about, but then it becomes rules and regulations and not about the relationship. And when the world starts pressing on you, man, you don't have that foundation to hold up against the pressures of the world. And so just like Daniel had this personal relationship with God and he had private time with God, you and I need to be doing the same thing. So that it keeps you from taking shortcuts and the easy way out, that you stay true to what you say you're going to do, that you're pursuing God. But then integrity will show up in your personal relationships as well. Integrity is something that should be evident to the people around you. Integrity is something that that friends in your life, the people close to you in your life, coworkers, that should be evident to them as well. And in Daniel's case, it wasn't his coworkers or friends that knew how much of a man of integrity he was. It was actually his enemies, his competition, that knew that he was a man of integrity. Look what it says in Daniel chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. It says, "At this, the administrators and satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, 'You will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God.'" These people that were his competition, that were people trying to take him down, they knew that Daniel was such a man of integrity that the only thing they could charge him with, the only scandal they could find against him, was that he wasn't following the laws of the land he was in now, that he was still pursuing a relationship with God. And integrity is something the people closest with you should see. They should know that you are a person that says yes and you mean yes, that you are a person that makes a promise and you follow through. And maybe one of the best ways for you to do this is get into a relationship with other people trying to pursue God as well. And what this means is maybe you need to get into a group and you need to have people in your life that are equally trying to pursue God, that you're trying to grow closer to God together. And we'll launch groups again this fall, and we want to invite you, if you're not in a group, get plugged in that way. And man, if you're in a group and you still need more accountability and you still need more help to be held accountable, surround yourself with 2 or 3 guys that can help you be held accountable. Ladies, same thing. Surround yourself with 2 or 3 other ladies that can help you be held accountable in your life. Give them permission to call out areas of your life where you're not living the way God wants you to, where you're not living with integrity. And make sure they give you permission to do the same for them. But ask yourself, if you went to the people closest to you in life today and said, "Am I a person of integrity?" what would they say? How would they respond? Because ultimately, the people close to you should see the life of integrity. And the third thing that I think we should learn about integrity from Daniel is that integrity is something that is on display in our public life. That even people close to us are aware of the integrity that we have. In this case, Daniel, the king, knew that Daniel was a man of integrity. Despite all the pressure Daniel had faced in life, he was a person who did what he said he was going to do. Look what it says in Daniel chapter 6, verses 13 and 14. "Then they said to the king, 'Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day.' And when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him." So the king could have easily said, "Put him to death. He's not following my decrees, put him to death." But the king knew that Daniel was such a great man, a man of such integrity, that the king was going out of his way to try to rescue and save Daniel. Likewise, in your life, whether you're close and you know your boss real well or not, your boss should know that you're a person that if they ask you to do something, you're going to do what they ask. That if you tell your boss, "I'm going to follow through and I'm going to make sure this gets done," that you should be a person they can trust to do that. But here's the thing about integrity. Integrity means that you have to be intentional about pursuing your relationship with God and about living with integrity. Because the second you let your foot off the gas when it comes to integrity, man, you're going to fall right back into the same old patterns that you've always been in. You have to be intentional and you have to keep pursuing God. You have to keep living without compromise. Not like the Pharisees who were twisting the truth, not like the Pharisees who didn't have the integrity to do what God actually wanted them to do, but instead just pursued the things that made them better, that advanced them. And Jesus is saying, listen, if you want to be my disciples, you want to follow after me, you want to be more like me, if you want to live this red letter life, then man, you have to be a person who lets your yes be yes and your no be no. But one of the greatest things is that Jesus knows all of us are going to fail at this sometimes. We're not going to be able to do all of the things that Jesus calls us to do. We're not going to live the life maybe that Jesus wants us to live. And this is where grace comes into the story. Jesus went to the cross to give you grace for those times in your life when you don't live up to or measure up to the life that he's calling us to live. And so today, I just want to invite you, as people that are trying to follow Jesus, to learn every day to let your yes be yes and your no be no. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, we thank you for your Son. We thank you for his willingness to come to this earth and to teach us how this life can be different, how we twist things and we manipulate things to fit our own needs and our own wants and our own desires. God, thank you that he takes that and he flips it on its head and shows us that if we're going to be his disciples, that we have to get to the point that people look at us and they say, man, that is a person who does what they say, who lets their yes be yes and their no be no. There's no compromise. There's no middle ground there. God, thank you that he also went to the cross and died to give us grace for those times we don't quite measure up. Thank you. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. Have a great week, everybody.